I call the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, the Labor Party will be supporting the legislation at its first instance to the Select Committee. We obviously want to be appraised of the detail as described by the Minister, and I would say that the measures on the face of it that the Minister's outlined will indeed go some way to helping to resolve an issue which has been dealt with by a number of governments and a large number of former and current Weathertight Homes ministers, myself included. I would just make a couple of historic observations. I do note that the Minister with goodwill has put these measures forward, but I do note when I was Minister of Building and Construction, the Honourable Nick Smith was wont to interject on me and others whenever this legislation came up as we tried to embark on put in place a series of measures to alleviate a problem that really at that point no one knew the extent of. Was wont to interject, just write a cheque and pay the money. And it's good to see that the Minister has, after a few years in government, actually worked out that it's never as simple as simply writing a cheque for an open-ended fiscal envelope, writing a cheque when you don't know the extent of the problem, and writing a cheque that simply would let, at the time, I remember as Minister, let those many in the building trade, not all, many quality builders and quality constructors and quality architects, etc., and designers, but would have simply let those people off the hook who perpetrated pretty shoddy work and left the victims in the cart that we're trying to assist here today. So I do recall the Minister sort of interjecting, just pay the money and write a cheque, and it was very good political opportunism at the time, but then he's got his feet under the cabinet table and worked out, as I did, that this is a very, very complex problem, one that has to be taken seriously, and I'm glad to see he is, that affect and has affected thousands of people's lives. Your home is your castle. Your home is the biggest asset generally that Kiwis have. It's your house is what you've worked for all your life, what you continue to work for and pay the mortgage for, and often it's the biggest financial burden on the family. And to have the rug pulled out through shoddy work, through certain folk, and I say only certain folk, both in the design community and the construction community, because there were reports, independent reports when we were in government, that showed there were failures right across the board, not just one section. Equally local government, the inspectorate, the last line of defence for your average Kiwi who builds or gets a home built, has it inspected. I well recall going to some local authorities before we ensured they were accredited to do the job properly, and retired building inspectors telling me, some of the North Island, that the days of the drive-by inspection had disappeared, thank goodness. Drive-by sort of wave at the building and say, yeah, we've signed it off. So this is an important piece of legislation, and the changes in here, I think, are pretty straightforward. It's simple. Changes to align the court decision of Osborne so that people are eligible on the basis of a compliance certificate, not simply on the basis of a dwelling being completed but not having a compliance certificate, and the other provisions that the Minister outlined, moving it from the Gazette to legislation. It would be interesting to know the history as to why, and it may be an issue around flexibility, as to why the provisions, if there was concern that they may be litigated, were simply not enshrined in the original legislation, or a bill brought into the House to enshrine them and not simply put in the Gazette notice, because it is slightly odd that we are embarking on making provisions that simply transfer the location of provisions from the Gazette notice to the bill. Now, there may well indeed be a very good rationale for that. It will be good to hear that rationale from officials and from others as we go through. I think it's also noteworthy that both sides of the House, I think, over this issue in many years have learnt a lot. If you look at partly the origin of this difficulty, I and others would argue, and many in the building trade, that the last national government, the Bolger government or Bolger-Shipley government, when they deregulated, the building and construction industry, so that anybody, God help me, myself included at the time, could have strapped on a tool belt and called myself a builder and gone around and taken money off people. And I don't think I'd be able to construct a doghouse, let alone a proper dwelling for somebody, but it was basically the cowboys were let in. There were no rules. Anybody could call themselves a builder. And prior to that, you did have a good old-fashioned thing called an apprenticeship. You did have proper training, and you did have, to be fair to the construction and design sector throughout, in historical terms, you know, the handshake and the following up on work done and the correcting of work that may have been wrong generally just happened. It was a very, very professional industry, and most, I have to say, in the construction sector still, and the design sector still, are exceptional professionals. But we pass legislation in this House not for those who will obey the law, but sadly for the minority who will abuse the law and who will look for ways to get around it. And I do say to the National Government that this is probably a very good example in historic terms of where deregulation of itself, as a sort of ideology, the principle we should deregulate, doesn't always work. It does not always work. And I think when we put in place the licensing of builders and construction folk and others, and the National Party then carried that on, rightly so, it was an attempt to weed out those in the industry who had perpetrated the problem, weed out those in the industry who had created and had actioned and executed the shoddy work, and then disappeared, gone broke, or used every legal and other means not to live up to their responsibilities. Because the truth is, those who actually design, build and inspect, those who are empowered to actually construct a building, in part or in whole, are responsible for that work and should stand by it. It's not actually the taxpayer, in fairness, nor is it, in any way, shape or form, the homeowner. But we did have people who simply just walked away. We did have people who just, you know, the company went broke. So that they did not have to live up to their responsibilities. But equally, as I say, local authorities, historically, many of them did not play their part. Many of them, and we tried to find a way through the original Weathertight Homes Resolution Service to give people an off-ramp, those who could not afford to go to court. Many of those who did go to court and could afford it got good outcomes. We tried to provide an alternative resolution service, which in fairness, I think had some very good points, but of itself did not wholly solve the problem. Just like no one piece or no one silver bullet throughout this whole unfortunate saga has solved this problem. So we welcome the ideas and the proposals put forward in this legislation. We'll be interested as it goes forward to the Select Committee. I'm sure we will get submissions from people who have been through hell in terms of trying to deal with this issue, who may well come up with other propositions or other remedies or other good ideas that hopefully we can record and amend and put into this legislation to make it better. Because there is, I think, the politics aside, goodwill and some of the glibness of the minister in his former life as an opposition spokesperson. I think most of that has been put asunder. This is a serious issue. I come from a province where housing is a major concern, not so much through leaky buildings, but through an act of God called an earthquake. And you can see where people's lives are almost destroyed. They have no way of coming back in many cases if their biggest asset is put in jeopardy. So we look forward to a debate on this. We look forward, I'm sure the Select Committee will do its job diligently in terms of working through this legislation, because all of us actually do want to see this issue brought to a resolution, want to get those people who are still going through the nightmare out of that and enable them to get on with their lives as best they can. But I say this to those out there who may watch this debate or may read about it in the paper, those who were responsible, those who did run to the bankruptcy court, as it were, those who didn't live up to their responsibilities. Not only did they give a bad name to all those good construction and design folk who all they need is a handshake because they will stand by their work, but they are ultimately, if not by law now, but they should be cognizant of the fact that they are ultimately the people who are responsible for this, not the victim, not actually the taxpayer, and they should have been brought to account. And some of them, Mr. Speaker, I wager, may not be able to sleep at night.
Mr. Speaker.